So I've been thinking about this more and more, and I feel like it hasn't been a talking point enough amongst media outlets covering the Bulls, and it's probably because most assume that the Bulls are going to be keeping their pick at number 11, and there's no way they would look to trade it. And while I do tend to agree in leaning the route of the Bulls keeping that pick, and I personally think it would be in their best interest to keep said pick, I also would not put it past this front office to trade it on draft night to either get off some of their bad contracts or try and package it in a deal to add, yet again, older win-now type players, because we all heard what AK said in his season-ending press conference. He wants to win. He wants to see this team in the playoffs. He would like to see this team win 10 more games next season. And so drafting a young prospect in a weak draft class, a project player who is likely going to be pretty raw, probably isn't going to sound that enticing to the front office if the goal is to try and remain competitive as possible. So it got me thinking that, even though it's an unlikely scenario, what would a trade package look like centered around the number 11 pick? And it's what we'll be talking about in this video. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I do want to be clear, and I'm sure most of you know this, but if the Bulls do in fact decide to trade that number 11 pick, the earliest they can do so is on draft night, as the Stepien rule prevents teams from sending out consecutive first-round picks. And given the Bulls owe their pick to San Antonio next year, even though it is top 10 protected, they are not able to trade this pick in advance of them making a selection. So if the Bulls do in fact move the pick, you won't be seeing it in the next few weeks. You'll have to wait until draft night and maybe even later as we hit free agency. Now, of course, it's being said by a lot of scouts around the league that this is arguably the weakest draft class from the last 25 years in the NBA, which is a pretty harsh critique, especially for those players entering the draft. There is no clear-cut number 1 pick. Level of talent, or the talent tiers, is pretty even across all of the players projected to go in the lottery. The draft doesn't really project to have any future star level players, but at the same time, I don't doubt that there will be gems in this draft. Solid rotational players and also NBA ready players who you can plug in right away and start actually contributing on an NBA roster. Now, I know I keep saying this, but I will have a draft prospects video out discussing some of the Bulls' best options for a player to select at number 11. I'm waiting to see how these guys look at the draft combine, which is currently in progress, before I make any sweeping conclusions about this draft class, especially when I watch very little college basketball and professional basketball overseas. But anyway, the reason I bring this up as far as this being a weak draft class is that it could take the Bulls down a couple of routes as far as how they go about handling this pick. And I look at it really from two angles. Either one, they of course keep the pick, try and draft a young prospect, maybe get an older prospect who they can use now to fill out some of the holes on their roster, and also use the fact that this is a weak draft class, knowing they could likely get the same level of talent as someone who is going to be going top 5 overall. Or they package the pick in a trade deal, given the pick, despite it being in a weak draft, is going to have value, given it's still a lottery pick. A lottery pick you can have this offseason rather than trading for a first-round pick 5 or 6 years in the future. There will be teams who are maybe looking to keep building on their future who will gladly take an immediate lottery pick. Now, as it relates to the route of keeping the pick, drafting a player to add to some of their young talent, I honestly think this could be an opportunity for the front office to snag a gem of a player later in the lottery and take advantage of the fact that because this draft is so unpredictable, you might just fall into a player that should have gone number 1. But you got them at number 11. I've seen a lot of scouts and analysts saying that the difference in talent between those projected to go number 1 overall versus those in the late lottery is negligible. I've said this before as well, but when you look at the host of mock draft boards across multiple outlets, there is no consistency or predictability for where some of these guys might go. You've seen 5 or 6 different guys projected to go number 1 overall. You've seen in some mock drafts a certain player to be projected going 13th, but then on other boards, that same player is in the top 5. And so if you're the Bulls, you have to take this as an opportunity to try and hit on what otherwise appears to be a crapshoot of a draft in terms of where you select, and get them at a much more cost-controlled rookie contract for the next 4 years. Like, you look at the difference in pay for the number 1 pick compared to the 11th pick, and it's substantial. The number 1 pick starting salary is estimated to be around $13 million in their first year, with the final year of their deal being north of $17 million for a number 1 pick in a weak draft class. That kind of stings when you compare it to some of the previous number 1 picks who were actually living up to that salary and then some. But at number 11, the projected salary for that rookie is a little over $5 million. And for the Bulls, that's huge for a team that is trying to stay under the tax line, but also trying to retain DeMar DeRozan and Patrick Williams, which we've talked about before, is going to be very challenging to do, and the cap gymnastics this front office is going to put in to stay just below that line. So getting a cost-controlled asset for the next 4 years, rather than continuing to pay out big extensions, is much more enticing for this Bulls team, especially with where they are in the current state of this roster. So that's the benefit in my view on why it makes more sense to keep the pick. It's possible you hit on a great player. There are a lot of bigs and wings that fit a position of need for the Bulls that are slated to go in that 10 to 15 range. It's a young player you can work with for the future rather than continuing to add old vets who are past their primes. That said, as it relates to trading this pick and what that would look like, I wouldn't be opposed to trading it, of course, depending on the return. Every player or pick has a price in this league, right? And if some team is willing to overpay for said pick, then so be it, go for it. What I worry though is that the Bulls will use this pick to get off of some of their bad contracts. Here's the thing, we all know the Bulls' primary focus this offseason is trading Zach Lavine. That is priority number one before everything else. Now, what we don't know is what is Zach Lavine's trade value going to look like this offseason. We can only go based on what it was at the trade deadline, which was non-existent. Either looking to get off of Zach's contract in the form of a salary dump, or even worse, having to attach an asset to make it enticing enough for a team to take on Zach's deal. And look, this isn't to say that Zach Lavine is a horrible player on this terrible contract. It's more so that the landscape of the league under the new CBA has fundamentally changed. Teams are wary of taking on long-term, high-dollar value contracts if the player is not a superstar. Gone are the days of 3 max-level players on a given team when you have the new luxury tax aprons in place. And so I'm sure there are teams who would want Zach on the roster in a vacuum. He's an efficient scorer, but not at his salary and also not coming off an injury. So for those who like to call me a Zach hater, or that I suggest lowball offers that they should take in return for Zach Lavine, no, this is the reality of his trade value right now. And if his trade value was higher, he would have been dealt last season when it was clear that the Bulls were trying to move him and that there was mutual interest between Zach also wanting to leave Chicago. Now, how does this relate to the number 11 pick and trading it? Well, I don't think the Bulls would do it, nor do I think they should do it because it's too valuable, but they could include that pick in a Zach Lavine trade deal to make it attractive enough for a team to want to buy. Not sure what that would look like. I mean, the teams we talked about before that would maybe be a good fit for Zach Lavine, the Sixers, Kings, Magic, Warriors, teams that either have the cap space to absorb his salary in a deal or have the salary matching capability in a player that they could send in return. Yeah, I'm sure any of those teams who were maybe a little bit wary on taking Zach's contract might make it a little bit different for them if it includes a number 11 pick. I think the Bulls would be overselling and attaching an asset that is too valuable just to get off of Zach's deal, and I think you're much more likely to simply move him in a salary dump for an expiring contract if that's really the best case scenario here. I mean, look at Ben Simmons. Yeah, expiring deal, whose deal comes off the books if you were to trade for him this season. But maybe the Bulls get desperate knowing that there really isn't going to be much change to this team this offseason unless you trade Zach. They might just have to overpay in order to trade him. Now, other instances of trading the number 11 pick could include trading the pick for a young player who is maybe a little more established, still developing, but a piece you can work with to help you compete now. A player who maybe isn't part of its current team's long-term plans, maybe a player like Nikola who hasn't gotten many minutes on the Miami Heat, or maybe Onyeka Okongwu, whose future on that team could be in doubt depending on if the Hawks actually draft Alexander Sarr, who is projected to potentially go number 1, and then also for a Hawks team that could be on the path to rebuilding and trying to stack as much draft capital as they possibly can. Getting a number 11 pick would be enticing them. Maybe a sign and trade deal for the Nets and Nick Claxton so the Bulls can actually use his salary to operate over the cap by getting his bird rights in a sign and trade deal. And the Nets are actually incentivized because it gives them a pick when they don't have a first round pick this year and sent what would have been their number 3 pick to the Houston Rockets. Maybe Noah Clowney from the Nets as well, who barely played last year as a rookie, but in my view has a ton of upside and was a top recruit coming out of high school. But yeah, I mean, there are options. I would much prefer the option of the Bulls sending out that pick for actual assets they could work with rather than using it as bait to get off some bad contracts. Like I would rather not send out the number 11 pick just to get out of the last 2 years of Nikola Vucevic's deal or include it in Lonzo's expiring contract. But honestly, I have no idea. I have no idea what this front office is going to do, and forgive me if I don't really trust them to make a competent decision. I had actually asked you all on Twitter if you thought the Bulls would trade or keep the pick. A lot of you felt that it was more likely that they're going to keep the pick rather than trade it, but we'll see. I'm sure we'll hear rumors swirling around between now and draft night of the Bulls potentially shopping that pick, so let me know what you guys think as far as whether you want to see the Bulls trading that pick versus keeping it. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.